Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Brendan Grady. He's the general manager of the analytics business unit at Qlik, and that's spelled Qlik. Brendan, good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it, Tom.
And our topic today is artificial intelligence, especially generative artificial intelligence, and especially the challenges that federal agencies have in deploying this in a way that comes out the way they need it to come out. And you've got some thoughts on the challenges there as they relate to the data that underlies the generative models that are coming out.
Absolutely. I mean, I think I've been in the analytics world pretty much my entire career. And as you think about, for those of us that have used data for years and years, structured data was really easy, right? It's rows and columns. You just sort of you manage it in the way you need to manage it. Now that we're in the world of generative AI, you really need to think about that trusted AI foundation being put in place and what you need to have because it's unstructured data. Some people would refer to it as times as the Wild West. You don't know where it came from. You don't know what the source are in a lot of cases. So having that explainability is going to be really, really critical. Um, it's introducing a challenge for everybody, whether it's in the commercial space or in the public sector space. Having trust in the information you're delivering is going to be key to supporting your mission at the different agencies that you're in.
And you found that if there is a lack of the right data powering an AI exercise, powering, a large language model, that it can sometimes fill in what it's missing. And that's when you get results that really can be off, which is a danger in the public sector.
Oh, completely. I mean, look, a survey was done. We did a survey looking at a lot of our organizations that work with us, and only 20% of those organizations said that they had some type of data foundation or data fabric in place to support any of their generative AI initiatives. And if you think about, for those of you here that have kicked the tires on ChatGPT, like myself, when you ask it a question, if it doesn't actually know the answer, it's going to make it up. And that's something that we can't afford to have. At Qlik, we're thinking about it a little differently, and we're going about our own generative AI offering. What I'm really excited about is when it doesn't have an answer, it says, I don't know. I can't answer that question. That right there says, oh, interesting. That provided me a trusted foundation, and they don't know the answer, and that's okay.
And in dealing with the private sector, what are you seeing is their demand for use cases? Why are they using generative AI generally? And contrast that maybe with what you're seeing in the government side, in the federal side.
It's in a lot of cases for in the commercial sector and the private sector, you're seeing generative AI being used for data synthesis. So basically, summarization, making recommendations on using natural language to say, you know what, here's the story that you want to tell, right? That's what we're seeing in the commercial sector. As you think about the public sector, it's the governments there are to serve their constituents, as we all know. So what you'll see is a lot about that citizen experience, right? Using it for knowledge bases, using it for information that describes policy, right? So a really big thing that we're starting to see is in the commercial sector, an HR use case, putting a generative AI knowledge base in place to ask questions about what is my benefit policy. That can be extended to the public sector, saying, what's our policy around Social Security? What's our policy around budget spend? And putting it in a way that customers can put these knowledge bases in place and serve them up to their constituents or their customers in the private sector.
Yeah, so that is really both powerful and risky, I would think, because what you're doing in effect is replacing what used to be a structured search for among structured databases to
Mhm.
get a definitive type of answer. Maybe the procurement database, the
Yep.
federal procurement database, or some source like that, which is the rows and columns. But now you're asking text and documents and so forth that may or may not give you the right answer unless they themselves are the right sources. Is that the essential challenge?
That's one of the essential challenges. And the key there is explainability. When you ask a question of a generative AI application, you need to be able to have confidence of where the information came from. One of the things we really focus on at Qlik is that explainability and that transparency, so that with our own generative AI offering that's called Qlik Answers, when you ask it a question, it will not only tell you this is the document where it came from, it will actually point you to the actual sentences and words where it came from so that you know that there is a source there that you can either trust or you can actually question. Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like a bill of materials, if you will, for the large language model.
That's a great way of thinking about it. It that's exactly it. It feels like to some extent it feels like I'm back at university again and I wrote a paper, about the theory of relativity, and what I ended up getting back from my professor was saying, can you cite the sources where you actually, got this information? It feels like that, right? And the consequences of getting it wrong, especially in the public sector, I mean, it can impact elections, it can impact budget spend, it can impact absolutely everything. So we've got to make sure that we're taking an approach where it's fully explainable.
All right, yeah, it's almost like in calculus. If you used an HP 40, the professor would say, well, show your work to make sure that you really knew what happened there. And
Exactly.
maybe you can give us some examples that you've seen where this is working successfully, maybe private or public.
Where it's working, the closest I would say is we I'll actually give a great example. We use it ourselves. Actually, we're using our own generative AI products to answer questions for our sales and marketing organization. What it does is it allows them to ask questions of, tell me more about our products. What do they do? How do they help certain industries? How do they help certain functions? So we're using it to generate messaging and stories and emails to communicate to our customers some of the value of what we're doing. We've seen it work fairly well there. Seen it in a private sector. So, for example, in financial services area where they're using it to synthesize some of their investment portfolio as they look at all of the different companies they have, be able to ask questions about what are the common threads between all of the companies we invest in, and getting it synthesized back. It's saving them dozens and dozens of people hours every single week.
And just a quick user question here. A lot of organizations are investing time and money in training users on how to query so that you can get something that's useful from a large language model. And you hear all of this talk about RAG, uh,
Yep.
retrieval augmented generation. Is that something that's got to be there too? We'll get to the data side, which is the back end of it, but on the front end, is that all relevant here?
Somewhat. I think there's a spectrum of people who are using AI. You've got your average mere mortal human being, like myself. I'm not hyper technical, where I just want to ask a question and get an answer. And how I get that answer is somewhat irrelevant to me, whether it was generated via RAG, whether it was some other way using search to do that. Then you get the people that are sort of in the middle. They sort of somewhat technical, somewhat not technical, who will try to go down the path with generating some of these knowledge bases using RAG. What we've seen is that it takes time, it takes money, and it takes a specific skill set. So our approach at Qlik has been try to obfuscate some of those more complex pieces and automate the chunking, automate all of the RAG activities, automate all the scheduling of updated of data so that we eliminate that manual heavy lifting. So really consumers, but also make it easier for people to generate the knowledge bases in LLMs.
And perhaps the other area of training for the users on their end is to check that transparency output, the sources that are cited, before you go ahead and use the answer you got, just to make sure, oh, yeah, well, they did ask the right places.
Yeah, the last thing you'd want to do is if you were working at a one of the agencies and you go to your deputy director and say, give an answer, and the deputy director comes back and says, you know what? How'd you get there? Or where did that come from? Not being able to answer that question would cause a very uncomfortable meeting between you and your deputy director. So something to think about as you're assessing generative AI. The thing I would really recommend is that you always poke on how can I be sure and get that explainability to be able to answer those questions.
All right, let's talk about the back end of this where Qlik operates, and that is the data, because basically every discussion comes around to, for good AI of any type, and especially generative, it's all about the data that you feed it and train it on. And so, how should agencies think about their data, organizing it, storing it, even arranging it, architecting it such that it will be useful for large language models?
Well, I think the first thing to think about, and this is someone that's been in sort of the business intelligence space for many years, as we expand into bringing AI into the different agencies, what you really want to think about is that your end users, whether they work for an agency or they're one of the residents here in the U.S., they're not going to care whether or not it's structured or unstructured data. They are not, right? You, your users have questions, they need to make decisions, and they want answers. So they'll be, as you think about how you structure that data, you need to treat your structured and unstructured data as first-class citizens, right? So you really think about getting that. You want to synthesize it in a way that it makes it available to absolutely everybody when they need it and how they want it. And that's going to get a little bit more on the front end. But we're seeing a lot of approaches about how data warehouses are architected, how data lakes are being brought together where you're combining structured and unstructured in one single location. In a lot of cases, you can't bring that data together in one single location. So you want to look to using technology like what Qlik offers, both on the back end and the front end, that allows you to combine those both structured and unstructured data. Because ultimately, those are the questions that your end users are going to want to be able to ask.
Right, we're hearing that in, like, for example, in the intelligence community, where they want to have a shared data environment, that it's not really physically possible to create one giant data lake with everything that they could possibly need for every purpose. And so they are talking in terms of this data fabric idea.
Yeah, I think as you think about the data fabric concept, I think we, as a Tolkien fan, who's read Lord of the Rings multiple times, everyone wants one ring to rule them all, which basically says I can put absolutely all of my information everywhere I need it. But what we're seeing is in the market is that more and more organizations realize that they are going to have a federated data challenge. And that data and companies are turning to a data fabric where they're putting technology on top of the data where they have it. And that's going to be to extract it, move it, transform it, and make it available in ways that organizations can just access it where the data resides, right? One of the thoughts is, especially in some of these agencies, you mentioned the intelligence community, they're never going to just put all of their data on one cloud provider, for example. We just can't see that happening from a risk management perspective. So you really need to think about how the data fabric will enable those data integration architectures that allows you to unify, integrate, and govern all of those disparate data environments, because it's just going to be a reality for many years to come, and also from a risk perspective.
And is there anything you need to do to the data otherwise, or does Qlik and a similar type of product perhaps provide that abstraction, or is it APIs, whatever the case might be, such that you don't need to do anything further than just make sure the right data is in the right place?
One of our philosophies here at Qlik is we don't want to force you to move your data where you don't want to move it. So the first thing you need to have is you need to make sure you have a data catalog that's been augmented with AI sitting on top of all of your data sources. Number one. Number two, you're going to want to make sure you have a knowledge graph in place where it's going to put semantics on top of that that can actually really give you more information and stories and linkages between that data. Obviously, having a metadata layer is absolutely critical. And then you'll want some type of recommendation engine that will recommend data sources based on what you're trying to do. And then ultimately, it gets that back down to data prep and integration and how you prep it for whatever your use case is. The real key thing that we're seeing in the commercial space, and the public sector needs to think about this too, is more and more organizations are looking at their data as a product, right? It's something that needs to be nurtured and managed and curated. And all of these pieces I just spoke about on the data fabric come into that. And that's something that if you treat it as a first class citizen, you treat it as a product, it'll be seen as having value. We go back. You've been in the space. You've been in the industry for many years, Tom. We can go back and remember when the early 2000s, data is the new oil. Remember,
Oh, yes. I've
we
heard that
all
many
remember
times.
that. I think we moved beyond data as the new oil, and for me, data is the new platinum, right? It's even more valuable than oil, right? And it's even more scarce. And you've got to manage that, and sort of that's how we're seeing the data fabric come in with this data product concept.
Yeah, in other words, whatever the mineral, it needs to be refined before it's
Correct.
nobody ever
Correct.
burned crude oil in their engine or anything.
Absolutely.
And is this the job of the chief data officer, which every agency, or at least all the CFO agencies and many of these smaller agencies are adding? But it
Mhm.
sounds like you really need your application people and your ultimate mission owners to be involved in designing all of this.
I think you just nailed that with your last comment. The mission owners, right? These are your subject matter experts for the areas that they're supporting. And those mission owners really need to take some responsibility and accountability for driving what that data is doing because ultimately, your subject matter experts are your mission owners. They know what you're trying to achieve, they're in support, but you also need to do that in conjunction with your chief data officer, right? So that the chief data officers tend to manage the foundation, what's put in place, but having those mission owners be the people that say, hey, this is what we need to achieve. This is what we're trying to get done. I know what this data is telling me. And we met with a federal agency recently, and they are really embracing this concept of data owner is the mission owners, with the CDO and CDAO really supporting the mission owners to drive what that data is telling them.
And by the way, people also mention the danger of hallucinations in AI output.
Yeah.
And my question is, how do you know whether something's a hallucination, or that is to say, false, or wow, that's a really great insight that I never dreamed of?
I think hallucinations it's a double-edged sword, right? Because one of the things that you think about some of the AI techniques were around deep learning and machine learning and really retraining models. Hallucinating can be a good thing. It can actually say, look, hey, why did I get this wrong? And you can actually figure out why. So that's the one side. The other side of the sword is if it hallucinates in a way that you don't actually realize it hallucinates, right? So I gave you my story of writing my own bio with ChatGPT, and it hallucinated and said I have my degree, PhD in applied math and physics. Patently false. The only reason I recognize it as a hallucination is because I know what my degree's in, which is German. But imagine just you trying to write my bio using ChatGPT. You would have never known. So you've got to have the concept of a human in the loop still for many of these things to make sure that the humans can actually still recognize this. Someone asked me the other day, is AI going to replace my job? And I said, I don't think AI is going to replace your job, not yet at least. But what I do know is that people that use AI to augment what they're currently doing will likely replace you if you choose not to use it.
And the administration has admonished agencies to use AI responsibly and ethically. And this is, now a requirement of federal agencies, and there's really long memos about that. It sounds like the organizing and curation and staging of data properly is the foundational step in that correct use of AI.
It is. I mean, it's as I mentioned earlier, I was in the BI space for many years, and you look at all the BI failures, companies that tried to implement BI, and it just never worked. When you go back and actually look at why, it wasn't aligned to a mission that they were trying to accomplish, and the data foundation was just not where it needed to be, and so they got information that wasn't useful to help make decisions in there. So getting this foundation of structured and unstructured data in a way that you can manage it with the data fabric, manage it with all the techniques I mentioned earlier, that will ensure that whatever you do on the front end by providing AI and providing visualizations and reporting and everything that goes with that, that you will have success there. I cannot emphasize enough of focus on the data first.
Some great insight. I want to thank today's guest. Brendan Grady is the general manager of the analytics business unit at Qlik. Thanks for being with us.
Tom, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
And I'm Federal Drive host Tom Temin. You're watching Federal News Network. Let's go back to the studio now for more on the Industry Exchange Cloud.